Great. Do we need to admit? She's doing. Okay, so I don't have to worry about it. No, you
Admit the waiting room. Very good.
I'm getting more admit. Should I go ahead and?
I got it.
Okay, got it. Okay. Great. Welcome, everyone. Sorry for the slightly late start. That's how it goes in the afternoon. This forum today is sponsored by the UW chapter of the AAUP. My name is Eva Chernyevsky. I'm a faculty member in English. I'm president of the chapter, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today. I apologize. I realize I'm trying to look at the room and at the screen at the same time, and I'm sure that's, I'm not going to succeed in doing that very well. Our perspective, so this forum today is an opportunity to think about what we have and what we need with respect to the portions of the faculty code, the UW faculty code that govern conduct and dispute resolution.
This is just where your sound is coming from, so you know it's way over here.
Okay, is everybody hearing me okay on the call? Okay.
Our chat is disabled, but you sound great. Everything,
Okay,
and we can see you.
Okay. There's a slightly new flavor of hybrid than I've done before. So our perspective on this matter on the UWP Executive Board is really informed by our casework. So unsurprisingly, we're the AAUP chapter. So faculty who feel that their rights have been compromised, who find themselves embroiled in disciplinary proceedings or grievance proceedings, routinely turn to the AAUP for advice and guidance. So we do a lot of casework. Every year we work through several cases, and that has really informed our thinking about the faculty code, how it operates now, and how we feel it should operate. And so I thought that what I would do to set the stage for the conversation we're about to have is to share with you a snapshot of just two cases that we've dealt with in recent years. And I think it will give you a sense of what is an issue for us in this discussion. So here's the first snapshot. A faculty member, the only African-American faculty member in their department, is brought up on disciplinary charges for having intimidated colleagues and creating an unsafe environment at a faculty meeting. What have they done to incur this charge? They advocated in terms their white colleagues deemed too strident for the department to endorse a Black Lives Matter resolution. The threatened consequences include salary penalties and an agreement to undergo anger management training. The faculty member fights the charges and eventually wins, but in order to do so within the adversarial context of conduct proceedings, they're compelled to retain legal counsel. In order to cover the attorney's fees, they end up having to take out a second mortgage on their home. That's the first snapshot. Snapshot two. A faculty member undergoes a tenure process rife with violations, including the disclosure of confidential materials, the application of evaluative standards that had not been brought to bear during pre-tenure reviews, and most egregiously, a mysterious faculty revote that turns a positive recommendation into a negative one. They file a grievance and are granted a hearing. At this hearing, the administrators who had mishandled the case exude impatient hostility. That is when they bother to turn on their cameras at all. Mostly they're just black boxes. The hearing board ultimately determines that the tenure process was indeed flawed, but hearing boards cannot confer tenure. They can only require a redo. And as a matter of course, redos are placed in the hands of the very same administrators who had overseen the flawed process in the first place. So the redo is rife with an entirely new set of violations. The faculty member, by this time under a doctor's supervision for stress-related health problems, throws in the towel and resigns. So that's the second snapshot. The first case highlights that in our current system, governed by the existing faculty code and by the policies of the UW Office of Academic Personnel. And as a side note, I might add that the policies of UW personnel often do not accord with the faculty code, but that's a separate can of worms. But under our current policies, the determination of whether a harm has occurred, by whom, and directed toward whom is left entirely to the discretion of UW administrators, that is generally chairs or deans. Even if one prevails against a charge of misconduct, the process of having to defend oneself is itself highly punitive. The second case highlights that there are no consequences for abuses of power by those in positions of authority. No obligation that they remediate the harm caused. So obviously, if the consequences of grossly mishandling a tenure case is that you get to mishandle it a second time, there is very little to make anyone think twice. So in short, what we have now in our view delivers neither on principles of shared governance, supposedly enshrined in the code, nor does it deliver justice. Our speakers today are going to help us imagine a radically different and equitable approach to dispute resolution. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton to my colleague, Rachel.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to this event. We're excited to have you and excited to introduce our speakers. We're going to start off with a guest coming to us from the University of New Orleans. Desiree Anderson is I want to congratulate on just recently becoming the Dean of Students at the University of New Orleans. She is best known and widely known in this country, in this context, for her work on maintaining the integrity of restorative justice on campuses, and is working on a new project to further embed restorative justice in other systems. The title for now of her contribution is Restorative and Transformative Justice 101 for Faculty. And we'll turn it over to welcome Desiree.
Thank you all so much for having me here. And I saw a couple people do a little golf clap. So appreciative to be in your presence this evening or afternoon. So as you can kind of see by my background, it says I'm in the city of New Orleans. I'm hanging out on Canal Street, but in actuality, I'm actually in San Francisco right now, doing some facilitation training with some individuals here at the University of California, San Francisco, over the course of 4 days. So today was day 3. I'm a little tired, but I'm really happy to be with you all. When we talk about this idea of radically reimagining what accountability and justice and things like that could look like, I like to borrow from my colleague, Jasmine Story, who often says, if I ask you what is 2 + 2, the answer is always 4. But if I ask you 4 equals, you can give me a variety of different ways that we can get to what equals 4, right? We can give you a 1 + 3, 5 - 1. I could even say 4 equals the seasons, right? We could think very differently and broadly about what restorative justice can be and what it can offer. So I'm going to show you just a couple of slides, hopefully, if I can get everything to function, and share my screen. Oh, goodness. Share. I'm so used to using double screen, so when I'm in one screen, it is a bit much. There we go. Hope you all can see that now. And so when we talk about what restorative justice is, first I like to use this quote here by Howard Zerr, which is that restorative justice is a compass and it's not a map, right? The beauty and curse of what restorative justice is that it is a framework, right? It is a philosophy, it's a principle, but there's not a certifying body. Right, it's fluid, it's flexible, it allows us to kind of come in and out of what these practices can be, but we also want to make sure that we're maintaining the integrity of what that is, and that is what we see here in this definition through Honeycomb Justice, the one that they offer, which is that restorative justice utilizes storytelling to name the impact of harm acknowledge needs, and then imagine solutions tailored, being the key word there, to needs and obligations within that community. And I emphasize the word tailored in the sense that what restorative justice offers is to recognize that everybody needs something a little bit different in response to the harm that they are experiencing. But it also allows us to think about the impact of harm beyond just the individual, right, that we know has been impacted, right? We might consider secondary targets. We consider the way that community is involved. We also think about systems in this when we talk about what restorative justice can do and can be for communities and people. And if you see the particular parts here, we have harm, needs, and then solutions and obligations, right? Those are the three elements. When we bring these three elements together is where we get the restorative justice part of this work. We have to address and name exactly what the harms are, and there's different types of harms: emotional, material, relational or communal, and then structural harm, right? So it's harms that have history around issues of oppression, right? All of the isms that also infiltrate and influence the way that we experience harm in our everyday lives and experiences. Oops. And so when we think about restorative justice, it has a couple of different practices that we are used to seeing, or you may have heard about. So one of those being circle processes that were developed out of North America, particularly out of Canada, and some of the work that they do there. And being able to be in community, building relationships with one another, and using the circle process to move people from one spot to another, right? So building this container in which we're able to tell stories about whatever it is that we're in the circle to talk about, whether it's a witnessing circle, a community building circle, it could be even a harm circle, etc. You also notice we have over here conferencing, which you can see comes out of New Zealand, but then really was written about out of Australia. And so particularly the conferencing comes from the Maori people who were noticing that in their communities that their children were being disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system, and decided to work alongside with the system to say, we have to do something different for our children, right? We are about community and collectivism. And so they started these funu, which is about, family conferencing, where they were bringing together the children, their families as support system, right? Our criminal justice system, and working through exactly what they were experiencing, the harm that they were experiencing that also resulted in them causing harm. And then what can we do to support them in making amends for the harm that they were causing to their community? And then many of you, I'm not going to talk too much about the truth and reconciliation, but you might be able to look more of that up around truth and reconciliation processes that happen in South Africa and many other places. But I also want to be clear about what restorative justice is not. And you may have heard lots of language around transformative justice as well. And so transformative justice is something, as I would say, it's newer, it's shinier, it is a beautiful tool. But we often can't really use transformative justice in our systems of higher education because transformative justice is trying to do justice away from the state, right? Being able to acknowledge state harm. And we know as institutions of higher education that we are doing things within the state, right? Within these systems where we have to engage perhaps police or on-campus security, right? We are a part of a state system in a lot of ways. It doesn't allow for organic and creative strategies sometimes in the sense that we may be obligated to respond in certain ways based on our systems that we have in our institutions. And so there is some distinctive ways in which transformative justice and restorative justice move together, but also they're very, very separate. So sometimes you'll hear people say RJ and TJ, but I want to make it clear that what RJ is allowing us to sort of work within state systems, while TJ is really focusing, how do we do this justice work outside of state systems? When we talk about restorative justice at our institutions, we're really looking at it from this kind of idea of whole school approach, the best way that we might be able to do that. And so you see our chart here, right? We have this pyramid, this idea of, the stuff at the bottom where we want to engage in the community building aspect of that. And the reason that's at the bottom and the reason it says 100% of your community is that part of what restorative justice is about repairing relationships, right? It's about making amends, rebuilding communities and things like that. But we can't really repair relationships if there weren't relationships in the first place, right? So you have to spend a good amount of time trying to figure out exactly what we are as a community and who we are to each other. It's about, in some ways, humanizing people, reminding us of our humanness, that our value as individual people and our role and responsibility as community for each other, and the ways that we show up. So we want to spend a good amount of our work, if we're doing the whole school approach, working on that ethos building, right? That community building, that making sure that everybody understands their role and responsibility of being a part of this community, that I'm getting to see you as a whole and full person as much as I can. And through that, it hopefully reduces my inclination to want to cause you harm in the first place. But more importantly, it makes me want to make amends if I do cause harm, but also if I'm the person who has been on the receiving end of harm, to want to allow you, right, to make amends with me, to being open to understanding both the intent and the impact, right? And then that next level is where we're responding to harm specifically, and that's where we're going to start seeing those things like restorative conferencing or restorative conversations, and I'll talk about what that looks like in a second, where we're looking at incidental harm that has happened and how do we approach that? How do we address the harms, the needs, and the solutions and obligations of the people involved? We're looking at answering the question, what happened, who was impacted, and what needs to be resolved in order, or what needs to be addressed in order to resolve it. And at the very top, then we're looking at reentry and support, right? So if someone has to leave our community for whatever reason, what does it look like to bring them back into that support, or with support? And it could be, a lot of times we talk about reentry through the lens of through harm, that someone caused harm and they had to leave our communities. But on the other side, it could be used for things like FMLA. Someone had to leave for medical leave for whatever reason, or mental health, and they're returning to communities. Or even if we're using our students, particularly thinking about like medical school, and your student had to leave and now they're in a different cohort. How do we welcome them back in there, right? So we can see that restorative processes and approaches can be used at a variety of different levels, but it works best when all of these are happening kind of simultaneously in our communities and in our spaces. And so when we talk about what restorative justice kind of looks like, one of the most important pieces of that, as we went back to the honeycomb justice's definition, is this idea of storytelling, the power of storytelling. And I know it feels very kumbaya right now to hear this idea of like storytelling. But as I'm in San Francisco doing training right now with faculty and staff at UCSF, and we just did the first 2 days around circle practice. And I was so excited to see what they had to say, and a couple of people returned for our conferencing, and they understood and they valued it. They can recognize the value of what storytelling can do. I'll give you a quick little story. I previously worked at St. Mary's College of California, and we did some circle work with our on-campus public safety, our police on campus. And this is obviously, you might imagine, a group of people who don't like to share, don't like to talk. And all I asked was the simple question of, what is your name and would you change it? Why or why not? Right. And I made sure I modeled what that is. And I won't go into specifics around what I shared, but just know that I shared something a little bit meaningful around the person who gave me my name. And I made sure that the chief of police shared next after me. And that turned into a 2-hour circle, right? 2 hours of just our campus public safety sharing their story about how they got their names, or if they wanted to change their name, why they wanted to change their name. And when we give people the space to be able to be open, to be vulnerable, right, and create the container for that to happen, people will use it. I got into this work specifically for a number of reasons, but one of the things that really sold me was watching 2 students ready to get into a physical fight with one another, taking a deep breath and saying, we need to have a circle, right? So here's students who have been kicked out of previous schools for fighting and other reasons, who are now at an alternative school, saying we need a circle, because they understand what this type of work can do for them to find another way of resolution. So storytelling really can be powerful, because again, it humanizes us. It reminds us of how we can show up together. It allows us to build connections and relationships with one another. But it also allows us to be able to deeply connect, to understand and unpack the harms, the needs, and obligations and solutions that we're trying to understand when harm has happened in communities with individuals, and to figure out who else might be impacted as we tell these stories. And so when we think about community building, I'm not going to go too deep into what this process looks like specifically, but recognizing that the goal of these really is about finding ways to build connections, talk about what the issue is, what are some ways that we might collaborate in finding the solution, and then how are we going to exit out together as a collective body? What are we doing together to work through? And concern doesn't always have to be something negative, right? We can have community building circles, circles of celebrations, right? Decision-making circles, governance circles. There's a variety of ways in which circling can happen in communities and spaces to bring together. But again, focusing on the incidental harm, and obviously part of what you all are really discussing is where we might use restorative justice conferencing. And so what this looks like in practice, right, is this idea of inquiry, where we're trying to find out, as the facilitators or whoever else might be involved, around the potential use of restorative justice. Sorry, it's really loud in the hotel. Hopefully, I don't know if you can hear the motorcycle going by. Where we're finding out exactly what are the needs of people through this work. How do we create safety for people to be able to share vulnerably in these different spaces, to gauge exactly what accountability could look like, what are the needs of individuals. And through that process, we're engaging what we call pre-work or pre-conferencing, where we're meeting individually to find out specifically what happened, what have you thought about since, what are the needs that need to be addressed, who's responsible for addressing those needs. We're also assessing for preparedness. Can someone actually name how they are accountable for the hurt and harm that they have caused? Is the person ready to hear both the intent and impact of the person who has caused them harm? This may require meeting multiple times. I had one incident where I met with the person who caused harm 6 times to make sure that they fully understand what the impact was of the harm that they caused and who was impacted, right? Because I didn't want to reharm the person who was impacted. And we're moving through this. And then if we feel like we can, we'll come together and meet as a collective body with the person who's caused harm, the person who was harmed, support individuals, potentially some community members, and of course the facilitator, to walk through the kind of process of these restorative questions. What happened? What were you thinking at the time? What have you thought about since? Who's been impacted and how, and what needs to be done to address the harm? Now, again, we would have worked through all of this many, many times prior to bringing people together. But the goal is to be able to walk through this as a collective body to get to this last part here of what are the needs, what are the possibilities, who's obligated to address them, and coming to some type of agreement on the tailored solutions, the tailored needs being addressed in that as we move through. So I know I'm moving through this like super fast, and I know you probably have like a million questions about what this is, but I wanted to just give you a really big kind of overview in the large scheme around what restorative justice is and how it kind of looks like in some practices. Do I have one more circle? Yes. I'm not going to talk about circles of support just because it might. Well, no, let's go ahead and do it. So as I mentioned at that top layer, circles of support or reentry circles really, again, is based off of this principle that no one is disposable, right? That no one does this alone. That the idea of this no more victims piece is that, one, people are actually really learning about how they have impacted other people. And through that learning are figuring out how to not do this harm again, right? So when we talk about this idea of accountability, what we're looking at is what's the responsibility? How do I take ownership of that? What actions am I taking to address those needs? And then what commitments am I making to not doing it again? And doing that with support, right? So we're not trying to shame people, because when people are shamed, their bodies shut down and they don't want to engage. So we're doing it with support. Doesn't mean we're coddling, right? Anything like that. but we're walking them through these processes of trying to understand someone else's experiences so that they can figure out how to take ownership of the way that they have caused harm, right? Same thing in these circles of support, right? We have a variety of people who are involved who are coming together to show one individual support and they're returning into spaces that they maybe had to exit. I threw a ton of slides at you all and a lot of information there. But when we conceptualize what restorative justice is and how it manifests in different spaces and communities, really is, again, in those three layers. The first layer really is about how do we build relationships? How do we build community so that we are seeing each other as humans, seeing each other as people willing to work with, to rebuild relationships or to not harm. And then how do we address incidental harm when it is happening in different spaces? And you can do that through circles or through conferencing. You can also do it through restorative coaching, using affective statements and all of those different types of things. So restorative justice is a framework, it's a principle, but it's also a way of living. So I approach pretty much everything in my work through a restorative lens, and the way that I even just do check-in questions with my students in my class. So when I teach my master's students, every single class, we start with just kind of a check-in question. And I remember last semester, I didn't do one in like week 14, and they were like, Dr. G, you didn't ask me how I feel today. So they get used to, again, finding ways to be in community with each other through these types of small practices and building of relationships. So I did, that was a super 101. And I know there's probably a lot of questions. So am I taking questions now, or are we waiting till later?
We're going to hear from all the panelists, because together you build a very complex and layered introduction to how faculty can think about how this might affect our lives and what we create in the future for our own improvement of this community. So thank you so much.
Great. I'll be here.
Our next guest is coming to us via video, because Jennifer Llewellyn, who is the chair in Restorative Justice and director of Restorative Justice Research, Innovation, and Education Lab at Dalhousie University, unfortunately is in midair and going to land in London soon, and generously actually filmed her contribution. So we're going to be watching that video, and then we'll be joined by her colleagues, Jacob McIsaac and Melissa McKay, who are going to be talking about case studies of working together in the Canadian context, but at universities and especially with faculty. So thank you. And I want to give out a shout of great gratitude for Hallie Pritchett, who is our technical expert and savior here. So Hallie will be pulling up that video, and this is Jennifer Llewellyn.
Hi, I'm so grateful to have the chance to contribute at least a little bit to this really exciting and important conversation that you're starting. And I understand this is just the start of a conversation to think about these important issues on your campus, and I hope that I'll have an opportunity to contribute further as you move forward in your work. I'm delighted that my colleagues Melissa McKay and Jacob McIsaac can be with you to share some of their experience on our campus and to be part of this conversation. So my job is to play setup a little bit in this conversation in advance of some of the stories and examples that Jake and Melissa are going to share with you. So the question I was given to frame my contribution today was the question for the panel: transforming justice for faculty at universities, is it possible? So spoiler alert, yes, I think it's possible, but not only is it possible, I think it's necessary. So the first thing I'm going to do is tell you why I think it's necessary. And then I'm going to start to frame up what I think is possible and turn it over to Melissa and Jake. So why is it necessary? It's necessary because the ways we approach discipline, conflict resolution, responding to harm between and amongst us as faculties on campuses and in our interactions and relationships with our institution is actually shaped by and sort of ripped off of our justice system processes, both criminal and civil justice system. And those processes are, that approach to justice, it has actually in recent days been significantly revealed to be failing. So why is it failing? Well, I think it's failing because it takes an approach that is fundamentally structured in 3 ways. And so, this is an entire course. I'm going to go through the slide in a minute. But just to sort of frame things up about why this might be failing and what kind of a different approach we need to take. The current approach to the way in which we do justice in the context of discipline, conflict resolution, addressing harm is individualistic. It looks at individual incidences and events in isolation. It focuses on individual behavior, rule breaking, or the interactions and impacts at interpersonal levels. And in the process of doing that, it fails to pay attention to context, causes, circumstances. And when it fails to do that, it can't see and ignores and then reinforces systemic injustices, structural injustices that are actually framing and structuring those relationships and the behaviors that we're concerned about. And then its way of responding is adversarial, whether that's at the level of investigations, whether that's at the level of conflict resolution, or at making determinations. And in its adversarial structure, it ignores complexity. It can't deal with nuance as it looks for the 2 sides of an issue and assumes that those sides are adverse in their interests. In doing so, it creates and furthers existing divisions and fractures. It incentivizes the kind of harmful behavior that we experience on our campuses, requiring people to behave in either offensive or defensive ways, and it is clearly traumatizing and re-traumatizing for those who participate in it. And then its strategy for change is a punitive one, right? Whether that's in settling and trying to get us back to the place we were before a harm, or whether it's in payback and consequences for harms. We are fundamentally focused in a backward-looking way to even the scale or address the past without significant attention or adequate attention to creating the conditions for a better future. And you know what? As a communication strategy and a change strategy, punitive strategies don't work. And we know that. We are faculty. We're good at pedagogy. We know what the good conditions for learning and change are, and being afraid of punishment or external motivation are not those ideal conditions to know better and do better on our campuses. So if we have the same kind of approach to justice as the current justice system, we can't be surprised that we have the same failings. So what are those? Well, here's the greatest hits of the ways in which our justice system is failing now. It's slow. It's hard to access. It produces inequalities in its outcomes. It doesn't meet the needs of those who are harmed. It doesn't often make situations better or safer. It reproduces and furthers systemic racism and sexism and exclusion. It's harmful to the relationships of those who are involved and to their long-term relationships with one another and in institutions. It reproduces power imbalances, and it traumatizes those who participate. This is not a very good report card. This is not something that we should be aspiring to pursue on our campuses, and it is no surprise that there are calls literally in our streets about the justice system for justice transformation that's loud and clear, and that we ought to be heeding those calls on our campuses. So how do we do that? Right? What's possible? Well, it is possible to take a different approach to justice. It is possible to pay attention to what justice actually requires, what justice actually seeks, which is just relations between and amongst faculty, between faculty and the institution, between and amongst groups, and at the systemic and structural level. And that's really what a restorative approach to justice offers. It's not a tool, it's not a mechanism, it's not a way to put people in a room in a nicer way to settle out conflict and claims. It's actually a way of thinking about what does justice require of us? How do we think differently about it? And then how do we do it differently? How do we structure policies, our practices, and our processes to be able to establish those conditions for just relations on our campus in response to harm and on the everyday? So a restorative approach then is based on a different view of justice and then is grounded in these principles that help us understand how to do justice differently. As I said, I'm sure I'm over my 5 minutes, and 5 minutes is just to start to say to you, we need to be thinking about doing justice differently in this principle-based way. And so you can see from these principles that this moves us from that individualistic view to a relational one, right? To one that pays attention to context, causes, and circumstances. From one that takes this adversarial approach to one that calls people in to their accountability to one another, to their responsibility to one another, to actually work together to discharge those responsibilities, and that doesn't think that punitive responses are a good approach to change, but actually thinks in this forward-focused way about how do we need to be creating the conditions for learning, understanding, planning, and action to be different and to live in more just ways with one another as faculty members on your campus. So when we do that, you're entering this conversation today about the difference this way of seeing justice would make to transforming our way of doing conflict resolution and discipline on campuses for faculty. But once you start to see this, you can't unsee it. And the places and spaces and processes that structure justice on our campuses include bargaining and negotiation, how you communicate, how you participate on campus, and importantly, how you govern and how you lead. And so while this is the start of your conversation, I hope it won't be the end. And so I'll turn it over to Jake and Melissa.
Wherever you are, Jennifer, may you land safely and travel safely. And I'm so grateful to have that foundation. I'm not going to take time except to honor and welcome Jake McIsaac, an Assistant Director, Security Services at Dalhousie University, who promotes restorative justice with campus security and stakeholders. Jake was part of a facilitation team overseeing the restorative justice process at the Dalhousie Faculty of Dentistry. Melissa McKay has extensive experience working in higher education administration, specializing in a restorative approach on issues of inclusion, equity, sexualized violence, and curriculum development. And we welcome you both to share your experience with us in this work. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Hello from the East Coast of Canada. It's about 8:45 p.m. Local time. We are calling from Nova Scotia, but traditionally the land of the Mi'kmaq people. And so we are constantly grounded in our work and our expression of this work from the place of our connection to this territory as settlers. A university administrator, that's Melissa. A security guard, that's me. And a law prof, that's Jen. We walk into a bar and it sounds like the setup for a really great joke, but this has been our working relationship over the last number of years. It is a ridiculous cast of characters, an assembly of folks who you wouldn't put together in any way, shape, or form to be your response team to something when it's going wrong. But we found each other. And we found each other not because we work in the same department or even that there are natural connections between our departments. It's actually this principled way of working that Jen has described that pulled us together in a way of imagining justice differently. What would it look like if we moved from a system-centered approach to justice, or what was required for justice, to a human-centered approach? And the shift is subtle, but it's basically this. When you consider what the humans at the center of conflict or an incident require, you start to think differently about the types of questions and opportunities, the runways, the pathways. What are their needs? And you can just get to a different place. So Admittedly, when we were thinking about this, we were very jealous about the opportunity that you folks are having, because as odd as it might seem, we've actually never had this conversation in our own institution. We've never slowed down and had the level of intention that you folks are turning your heads to say, what's possible and where should we start? We ended up showing up because somewhere along the way, something was on fire, and they said, we should get that group of people who work together in that way that we really don't understand, but it seems to go okay. And so something was on fire, and we responded restoratively in some of the principled ways that Jen has described. Melissa will talk to you about a report that she wrote that sometimes people read, but it's really long. But we, it started to put us on the radar locally within our institution. That's great until the next fire. Something flares up and they like the last thing, and they're not really sure why they like the last thing, but let's get those folks again. And so now, many years later, we're actually doing what you folks are doing now. You have to start somewhere to go everywhere or to go anywhere. So that's fair. But over time, what folks have started to pay attention to was this principled way of working, and this, what we call Team RJ, was because it was more than what do you do in circle or how do you put people in circle. For us, we use restorative justice as a truncated sentence. It's a restorative approach to justice, as we have a restorative approach to education and a restorative approach to, you might imagine, as a security guard. Well, that's what I say, but we decided to get bold about the assignment. The scheme was this: what would it look like if we actually started to reimagine what public safety looked like on our campus? We moved away from an enforcement model of safety, and so built on those systems of oppression. What would it look like if we used restorative principles and EDIA principles to build an anti-oppressive approach to keeping each other safe? What if it didn't belong to one department, and we didn't, as a community, abdicate all of our responsibilities for keeping each other safe, and we found those pathways by asking people, what do they need? What do they need from each other? What do they need from the institution to be and feel safer and connected? And so we started to reimagine who we were in these processes, not just this team of folks who get dropped in to do an investigation. Investigations burn the house down. And so that's what we were reacting to, is why were people not reaching out, paying attention to the types of questions investigations ask. What happened? What was the policy or violation that was contravened? Who was responsible, and what are the possible remedies, if any? Within a restorative approach, we ask different questions to the humans. What matters most about what happened? What has this been like for those humans most directly impacted? What's the context? What would have helped this go well if we could have gone back? What do we need to do moving forward? What do we need to pay attention to the conditions? So I'll bump it over to my colleague, Melissa, to give you a sense of how we did some of that in one particular case.
Amazing. Thanks, Jake. And it's great to be with you all this evening here, this afternoon, and other places. Following Jake is always tough, but I wanted to chat with you about one of those fires that we were called in to attend to. And there is a large report. If anyone's interested in reading a 60-page report about a single process, we can send you the link and follow up. This would be related to the case mentioned in Jake's bio, the restorative process in the Faculty of Dentistry back in 2014-15 on Dalhousie's campus. And so if you can imagine, this was my first day on the job in our Human Rights and Equity Services office. I was coming in, I had worked in the university in different capacities, but I was coming in to a new role as the sexualized violence advisor. So responding and trying to, be really helpful in cases where there had been a complaint of sexualized violence on our campus. And my first day, we received a complaint from 5 women, female identified folk at our Faculty of Dentistry about a series of posts made to a all-male secret or private but not secret Facebook group that their colleagues posted sexist, misogynist, homophobic, racist content about just generally and about them. And they had come to learn about these posts and were deeply, as you can imagine, hurt and wanted to understand what could be done. From that, we quickly learned that what mattered to them from the outset, to most of them from the outset, was that they wanted to understand how their male colleagues would go forward in this world differently and how this would matter, because they knew these male colleagues quite well. They had spent 4 years with them. They were in their final year and were about to graduate into a profession that's self-regulated. And they knew that these men would go on to have a career in a male-dominated field where they held a lot of power. And so they wanted this to be impactful. They wanted it to matter. And they also had a variety of experiences that made this not isolated. So their experience in their faculty was not one that this would be 13 bad apples who made their experience one that included sexism. They had other experiences with their faculty members, with their fellow students. And we came to understand that this was a culture climate issue. So as Jake mentioned, as we're thinking about all of those things, about what matters about this, about what do we need to do to move forward well, how do we understand what happened? How do we understand the context, the causes, the circumstances, the root causes of what happened? We started from a point of working with students, but it quickly became about the faculty, about the place. As we learned more, as we started our restorative approach to investigation, we found truth about those female students' experiences in classrooms. And they talked to us about sitting in a classroom where a male identified professor used bikini-clad women as a teaching aid, photos as a teaching aid, and how impactful that was to them to sit in a classroom where they were, not quite half, a class of not quite half female identified folk. And they raised this. They raised in class and felt that it was unaddressed. So they thought nothing ever happened with this. Nobody cared about this. And this was one of the things that they showed us about this being bigger than these 13 men. And so we took that on as a part of this process. We said, this really actually matters deeply. It's not just about these 13 men. It's about all of us. It's about holding the mirror up to understand how this could happen here and what we owe to each other. So this was an opportunity for us to be able to work with faculty in a different way in this process. So we were able to work with this faculty member in particular to talk about the impact of the way that he was teaching at the front of the room, the impact that had on his class, the way that normalized sexist attitudes across the classroom, and for him to be able to understand that impact. But we also learned deeply through that investigation that this was not just happening in 2015. This had happened in 2014, in 2010, it had happened as long as anyone could remember. that these were the kinds of attitudes that proliferated, that were normal, that were everyday. And so what we were able to do was to think, well, how do we get at that? Because this isn't just working with this individual faculty member to change his attitudes and behaviors toward teaching. This is actually about trying to understand how we respond better when things like this go wrong. So working with the faculty who initially took disclosures from students, and those students felt that nothing was done. Sometimes things are done, but we're just not transparent about what has happened and how that outcome has been achieved or not. Sometimes nothing has been done because people don't know what to do. And so we were able to build capacity amongst those who would be receiving disclosures of this nature to say, what would you do? How would you respond well when this comes through your door? And it will come through your door, so be prepared. How do we do that together? So we were able to think about that. And we also created an ongoing event. So we called it the Women in Dentistry Circle, where we brought together female dentists, female identified dentists working in the profession who had graduated 20 years on, along with newer graduates, with the women who were about to graduate. And we had a closed circle for women identified folks only, folks who self-identified in, to talk about what that experience is like. What was the experience like coming through their education? And what's it been like? What are the challenges? What are the hurdles? What are the successes that they've experienced in the profession? And how could they be supportive? What kind of advice, mentorship, what would you tell yourself leaving the Faculty of Dentistry if you had the chance to do it over again? And so that is an event that, to my knowledge, continues, that brings together community to support shifting culture across not just the faculty, but across the profession, because we know that was of keen interest and it mattered deeply, both to the faculty and to those most affected in this instance.
Can I just add one part? It just popped in before I lose it. One of the really exciting parts about this process was that Jen would have showed the principles that we talked about. One of the principles that we rooted this particular process in was individual and collective responsibility. So oftentimes, the restorative process can look like it's only about interpersonal. And for us, it actually had to be about the relationship to the systems and structures as well. So it had to be shifting, and every case, and this is one of the lessons that we would lift out of our dentistry case, maybe for you folks to consider, is every case is an opportunity to hold the mirror up and say, it's tempting to actually make it only about the students. It's tempting to make this about Facebook post. But the opportunity, if we're brave enough to lean into it, is, what does this say about us? Even if I didn't have 13 students to hang this case on, could we still do work here? Is there anything we could learn here? And so it's a reflective space. It's a space that if we're brave, we lean into and say, what else is there to learn? And so when we talk about a relational approach to justice, or just relations, we think about justice requiring, almost if you were baking a justice cake, what would it look like? People are really adept at describing injustices or what the experience of unfair feels like. Really great at that. But sometimes when we actually push people to say, describe the conditions of justice, what is it? And so for us, building on a lot of Jennifer's work, in some great articles that you can find on the restorativelab.ca, CA, I don't ever know.
Yeah.
She's going to be angry with me on that. If you imagine, it requires at least these three things: respect, equal care and concern, and conditions where your human dignity is recognized and assured. And so if respect, equal care and concern, and where human dignity is recognized and assured. I don't just need that from the people interpersonally, I need that from the systems and structures. So what we were able to do when we got to the dentistry process was to say to the faculty members, you would love to believe the narrative that this is just about the men and the women in this room, but this is actually a story about you, who you are, who you've been, and who you are becoming. And so if you want who you are, they're your legacy as you go out into the profession. This was an uncomfortable space because faculty members said, well, I'm really good at these skills. I'm really good at teaching how to do fill cavities,
Crown.
pull teeth, do crown work, restorative dentistry. They were really great at these things. And they said, now you're expecting us to know all of this other stuff. And it was terrifying, actually, for a space for some of these faculty members who were technically brilliant, but lacked actually some of the ways of relating to say, you're actually teaching them way more than skills here. You're actually teaching them how to survive or fail in the profession. And if you don't spend time in this process unpacking privilege, white supremacy, the patriarchy, and we had to take all of those things on throughout this process because they were showing up. And when they were showing up, not just in the Facebook post that these men had, but actually we could draw the line directly to, as Melissa said, that teaching tool that favorite professor used in the class, so that when the men sit down with us and we said, what's going on here? They said, well, we thought it was okay. Professor so-and-so does this. So if we were going to fix it here, we had to chase all of the threads and all of the breadcrumbs all the way through. And so we used in this case study, and I know we are over time, so we'll stop here and we can take questions, but we use this case study to show, again, where you could start to go everywhere. We hope that gave you something to think about. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jake and Melissa. It's really important to bring this down to the ground for people who really can't picture what this looks like. And I like that you brought up that we have to move from being able to describe injustice to being able to imagine some other possibility. And I'm going to just inject here before I introduce Chris Cauce. I'm going to interject the sort of crisis situation to which this thoughtful conversation was at least the first step to addressing. At University of Washington, we have faculty code that has been deemed over the last years not to serve faculty, especially in the areas of conflict and grievance. It was deemed such that a task force was put together to make changes to that. That over several years, when it was presented this winter or over the last fall to the president and to administrators, it was rejected, and it was proposed that a piecemeal administratively driven process would be put in place. And what's really important that AAUP has been considering is whether or not either of those versions, and especially a piecemeal approach, is really going to put us in a position to actually address what doesn't work and to envision something new. And the three things that we're really worried about that we're not sure has changed is that the system is capricious. The capricious use of processes that are punishing and that focus on disposability is really important. Separation, disposability, and punishment. The second thing is that there are no guidelines for defining harm amongst and between faculty. And the third is the absence of shared governance to decide what those processes would look like, and when those processes are put in place, that they actually are binding, that they are actually respected. You talked about respect. So that's kind of the situation that we're in. And I'd like to use that to introduce Chris Cauce, who comes to us from a university system that has actually responded to a lack of shared governance with unionization. Chris is a PhD in sociology. He teaches at San Jose State University, and he's the affirmative action representative for the San Jose State chapter of the California Faculty Association. Welcome, Chris, and thank you for being with us.
Great. Well, thank you all. I'm glad to be here with you. My name is Chris Cauce. I am a lecturer faculty member at San Jose State University, which is what you see behind me in the picture. I am coming to you from Muwekma Ohlone land here in Northern California in the San Francisco Bay Area. I've already been given an upgrade in this. Unfortunately, my dissertation is not totally done, so I'm not doctor yet, but I'm working my way there. and my emphasis is in the sociology of education. And also, there's so many wonderful things that we've talked about today so far, and you've all just brought up so much great stuff. It's like I want to just throw away my PowerPoint and just talk directly to the things that you've spoken to, but I'm not going to quite do that. I am actually going to pull up a PowerPoint here in just a moment. Because I do want to talk to you a little bit about what we are doing in the California Faculty Association when it comes to our work on, pardon me for a second here, all of our work on, if I can get this to go, there we go. Okay, great. Our work on dealing with basically conflict in the workplace. And we have had a big push to create alternatives for dealing with conflicts, dealing with problems in the workplace, beyond just the use of campus police. And so one of the things that we've done, I will say, just to give a little bit of context, I know I'm coming from a place that's a little different from where you all are, so I don't want to bog you down with boring details, but I also want to give a little bit of clarity because I think our system might be a little bit different than what you all are accustomed to. And so our union, the California Faculty Association, is a union that represents all 23 campuses of the CSU system. And so that includes the campus where I am, which is San Jose State, which, by the way, is the oldest public university on the West Coast. And then it also includes other campuses that have developed at different times in the state of California, coalescing into the system that we have now that basically started in 1960 with the Master Plan for Higher Education in California. And it designated 3 major groups in California for higher education. And one of those being the UC system, University of California, which has kind of the bulk, its original charge was it has most of the graduate programs, especially doctoral programs. Then we also have the CSU program, the California State University, which is actually the largest university system in the United States. And we have 23 campuses. We represent about, the numbers are a little fuzzy now because COVID's changed everything, but we've got about 450,000 students in the CSU system. And we have 29,000 faculty that are represented by the California Faculty Association, split between the 3 systems, okay? We are different from our UC counterparts in that we have one overarching union for all 23 campuses, whereas the UC system, the workers in the UC system, the faculty in the UC system are unionized, but they do not have a single overarching organization. They have multiple kind of smaller groups. Our faculty association, our union, represents tenure line faculty, non-tenure line faculty, which includes lecturers, whether they're part-time or full-time. It also includes counselors, coaches, and librarians, okay? The counselors that we include are the counselors who give mental health counseling to students. The counselors that do academic counseling are in a separate unit. They are not a part of our unit. They are in what we call CSUEU, California State University Employees Union, and also in APC, Academic Professionals of California. So we're split in ways that are a little bit tricky, I guess you would say, okay? For those of you who may be familiar with the UC system, you'll note that our terminology is reversed in a few ways. One of those being that in the UC system, each campus has its own campus chancellor to run the campus, and the system is headed by a president. However, for us in the CSU system, it's reversed. Our system is led by a chancellor, and each individual campus has its own president as a local administrator. So the title that you heard a moment ago is actually a title for me that has changed. My title is now the Associate Vice President for the Council for Racial and Social Justice. And that's North because we're a big state, so we're split. And there's a significance to the change in name. We used to be called the Council for Affirmative Action. And the reason for selecting that name and the time that it was selected was that California passed a law in the 1990s that actually outlawed the use of affirmative action in the UC CSU systems. It wasn't really so relevant to the community college system, which is our 3rd pillar, right? But in that case, we decided that we wanted to still take on the mission of racial equity and racial justice in the system. So we use the term affirmative action as a way to kind of fight back against that which had been taken away. But a couple of years ago, we changed that because our mission is expanded. We are not just now focused on those concerns that were under the umbrella of affirmative action in terms of our presence in the system, but we're much more focused on a broader vision of what justice is and what racial justice is, and how the racial justice that we seek within our university system is also the racial justice that we seek in the society, right? And that those two things are not separate, that in fact they are connected, okay? And so with our anti-racism and social justice focus, right, our Council for Racial and Social Justice is really focused on incorporating the perspectives of our members of color to addressing a variety of the concerns that exist in the various campuses that we have, as well as the communities that feed our campuses and the communities that our campuses are a part of, right? Because my campus, for example, San Jose State, is right in the middle of downtown. The separation between the community of downtown San Jose and the campus community of San Jose State is little to none in reality, right? There's kind of a confluence between the community and the university. And so to that extent, our broader organization has decided that, one of the things that we need to do as a union is reframe this idea of what unions normally look at as bread and butter concerns for the union, right? The bread and the butter is usually the money, and then sometimes the benefits and the money, and then of course money. I like money, I need money. Believe me, living in the Bay Area in California is not a place to be broke, because it is a hard place to live. That being said, it is also not my only concern in my employment. It is not the only concern of us in our employment in the way that our systems work. And so we need to reframe that idea. We need to look at things like racial and social justice concerns as part of the bread and the butter for which the union works. And so this has led us in this time period, especially since 2020, with the racial reckoning in the wake of the Breonna Taylor and George Floyd killings, as well as many others, that we within our own context have a problem, that we need to think about how do we solve problems on our campuses outside of the use of armed, uniformed police, right? We need to have more options than simply calling the cops on each other when we have a dispute. We need to have more options than calling the police on our students when there is a dispute. We just cannot be a one-trick pony in this sense, where this is the only thing that we have going for us in problem solving, because, for multiple reasons, but one of the things that we know for a fact is that many of us are coming from communities where police are, often weaponized against us, right? And it becomes very easy to escalate a conflict into something that goes far beyond what it was originally when we start to get uniformed officers involved when it's really not necessary, right? And so that's one of many kind of concerns that we have as a union. And so just an example, and by the way, I will make, I put together a couple of links in this PowerPoint, and I will make them available if anybody would like, but these are just stories that kind of highlight a few points as we go along. And so a couple of years ago, there was an incident on the Sacramento State campus, which is in our state's capital. And there was a professor by the name of David Moore. He's the only African-American professor in the College of Business. And the short version of a long story is that he had been an advisor to a student club, one of the business student organizations, had stepped back and had another colleague kind of handling certain functions, but was coming to a meeting where the students were going to be presenting on one of the things, their campaigns, or one of the things that they were working on. A fellow faculty member with whom David Moore had, some kind of rocky relationship, was upset that he was present and demanded that he leave. And ultimately, he didn't see any reason why he should leave. And so this person winds up calling the police to have the police remove him, even though he was not engaged in any action that was disruptive or, certainly not any kind of criminal act or activity. Okay, and this is just one example that highlights why our focus and part of our concern as the California Faculty Association is that we need to have methods of addressing conflicts, methods of addressing problems that actually are much more restorative in their nature, because not everything needs to go to the level of having, police create a hostility a lot of the time when they arrive. And a lot of the time, even without, this is not attributing any negative quality or characteristic to police, but they're coming in and being told something about a situation. And when the police are called, oftentimes the assumption is that they're being called because something substantive is actually happening. And so often they will show up in a space with the expectation that something substantive is happening. And they're not too quick to transform or to shift into the mode of understanding that nothing substantive is happening. And therefore there's no reason to really interact, right? And so to this, it just is one of many, many examples. We've had examples of many of our members being pulled over on campus by police, being harassed, et cetera, being harassed by their coworkers and colleagues in a variety of ways. And so what we started to do in our last bargaining campaign was we incorporated a variety of what we referred to as our anti-racism and social justice proposals into the bargaining process so that we can affect a structural change at the level of CSU management and leadership. And so we actually began the process of bargaining in 2020, which was unfortunate because we got hit by a big pandemic and everything shut down and everything was, thrown askew, okay? The other reason that it was a little bit unfortunate was that we had a chancellor who was supposed to retire in 2020, in June of 2020. But because of the pandemic and because of the way that it affected everything, that person remained in place until December of 2020 and extended their time working, right? So all of these things really altered the timeline of our bargaining. But we ultimately were able to ratify a new contract in February of 2020, right? The agreement basically happened in January and our members voted in February and approved the contract. And so some of the non-economic gains in our contract were a recognition of cultural taxation. And so one of these things is we got the CSU management to recognize that many of us, especially as faculty of color, Native and Indigenous faculty, right, women faculty, trans faculty, we're often called upon to serve the community beyond the kind of parameters of our work, right? And just to give you an example of this, it was, I think, in 2019 when the movie Black Panther came out. For some reason, there was a press story that was, coming out about the importance of the movie Black Panther. And so I get this phone call frantic from somebody on my campus. And basically it was, we have this interview to do. We need a Black faculty member to talk about Black Panther and why it's important. I hadn't seen the movie yet. And so, I'm not going to volunteer to speak to it. But one of the things that I pointed out to them was that I absolutely assure you that none of my white colleagues got a phone call today saying, hey, there's a movie with some white people in it. Come and tell us about it. Right. And so we recognize that a lot of the time, and this actually, just speaking out of reality, this happened to me yesterday. I was sitting with a student who is in crisis mode. We don't have enough counselors on campus, but because of my identity and this person's identity, I often am the one that students come to. I get a lot of students of color coming to me for support, Black students, but definitely a lot of students of other ethnic groups, right? And so we now have within our contract the ability for us to get assigned time, release time for some of the work that we do that goes above and beyond what our contract says, but where we are actually serving our community. So that was a really big one for us. We also got some language to help us address bias in student evaluations. We instituted caste as a protected category in our non-discrimination article, which was huge, and it was not a fight without controversy, let me tell you. But one of the things that we really did get was an agreement, a memorandum of understanding for us as a union, as well as the CSU leadership, to convene a task force to look into alternatives to the use of police for dispute resolution on campus, okay? But there's a problem. We did actually have some losses at the bargaining table. We didn't really get what we wanted, which was the creation of an ombudsperson's office to help us to handle faculty disputes internally without it just being strictly punitive, okay? We had a few other things that I put in here that I'm not gonna go into because it's not directly relevant to us, but we were fighting for lengthening lecturer contracts, adjusting our parental leave, et cetera, right? We had some of these proposals that were part of our social justice work. But here's the problem. So we wound up with, and pardon me for a minute, because I may have to go back and forth to explain a little bit. We wound up with a new chancellor, and our new chancellor was around for a little while when we were going through the bargaining process. And then that chancellor actually had to resign because of Title IX issues. So we've actually had some problems when it comes to our leadership, okay? But what happened was this, the short version is, we were under Chancellor Castro to convene a task force to look into alternatives for dispute resolution, alternatives to campus policing. And then once Chancellor Castro left, we got an interim chancellor who is still there, who has basically stalled completely and has refused to convene any task force. But for us in CFA, that does not stop us. So we took a legislative approach. If leadership won't listen, we turn to the legislature to make them listen. And so we were able to support a bill, AB 1997, which actually sets as a part of California law that we are required to convene a task force to look into alternatives to campus police. And that law was signed by our governor last September. Okay, and there's the text to that law that I'll make available to you if you would like. Okay, and the first part of that text basically says that by this July 1st, 2023, the CSU must convene a stakeholder work group. At this point, on April 19th, 2023, the CSU leadership has taken absolute zero action. They have done nothing. It also turns out that July is the time that our new chancellor is expected to take office. So we believe that the current interim chancellor is just going to stall all the way until the very last second and then leave it alone so that it does not turn into her problem, right? But there's another layer of complication here for us, and that is that we have actually had, in addition to the chancellor, we've had several high-profile cases related to Title IX. Okay, and so basically the super short version is that our former chancellor resigned, and he was pressured to do so by the Board of Trustees because of the way he handled or mishandled sexual harassment cases while he was the president of Fresno State. Near and dear to my heart, very painful near and dear to my heart, is that my campus's former president, Mary Papazian, also resigned due to similar things. On my campus, what we had, the short version is, we had an athletic trainer who is now facing criminal charges for sexually molesting female student athletes. And in the process, we had one of the coaches who came forward to be a whistleblower, and the athletic director basically engaged in retaliation against him for his whistleblowing. And it all got blown up by a huge article series of articles in USA Today, which has been particularly embarrassing for my university, right? But among the things that this puts forward for us is the fact that because we have massive Title IX problems throughout the system, our administration right now seems to be much more focused on discipline of faculty. And my perspective, my opinion of it is that they are more concerned over liability and over public reputation instead of the actual work and instead of creating significant structural change to solve problems. It is much more about the image of looking like you were doing the right thing instead of really being focused on making a transformation, making a structural change within the CSU system. And that's one of the things that we are continuing to fight against. But I think several things kind of emerge here. One of the things is that when we are in spaces where there isn't necessarily always such a good well-paved road to travel, and you have to kind of create new ways of doing things, I think that it always in situations like this is going to put people in positions of power in a kind of a strange space, because on the one hand, to try something new is to put yourself in a vulnerable position. But from our point of view as a union, to keep the status quo is to put yourself in a vulnerable position to continue to have the same problems resurface over and over and over again. I will tell you that in my 23 years teaching in the CSU system, I have had 10 university presidents on one campus. That level of turnover creates problem after problem after problem. Not all of the presidents that have left in scandal, but more than one has, and it does create this situation. So until we actually create structural change within the CSU and to be able to do so at the level of our collective bargaining agreement, we don't really see that we're going to get quite the kind of transformational change that we really want. We want a transformational change that goes beyond surface level and really helps us to do many of the things that you were talking about, which is really to kind of address and repair relationships, repair damage. Many of us, folks who get tenure, and many of us now who are non-tenure line, but who have long careers in the same place, you can get tenure and you're going to be looking at the same person for the next 30 years. And if you don't have a method of figuring out how to solve a dispute, you're going to have 30 years of pain. 30 years of misery. And you cannot have 30 years of pain and misery and then think to yourself that it does not leak out and affect your students and affect other people in the university environment. So it's of the utmost importance for us to continue on with these fights and to recognize that these are not short-term things, right? We did not jump for joy once we got the governor to sign our bill, because we know that that's actually the start of the work. It's not the end of the work, right? I'm going to leave you at that, at this particular point, because I think there's probably going to be some good Q&A for us to jump into. But I did want to just address finally that last statement. And I really love, Desiree, one of the things that you talked about in terms of what we do within the state and outside of the state. And I think that we actually have to have approaches that help us at multiple levels, right? Because part of the thing is that the interpersonal conflicts between folks are things that those are spaces where we absolutely have to, have a change, transformation, and to be able to kind of correct and repair damage. But I think we can't look at that to the exclusion of thinking that if we just change people's behavior, then the institutions themselves will magically follow, because we know that they won't. We have to have that structural and institutional change, as well as to change each and every heart and mind. And thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Chris. Every time that I'm with you, you leave people with hope in the face of a gargantuan task that you've also put out, the complexity of it. So thank you so much. This was a brilliant layered cake of everything that we need. And before we open it up to questions, which we should do very, very quickly, I want to remind many of the faculty out there, we've heard lots of approaches to this idea of restorative justice, of why we need to care about this. And one of the things that we didn't say at the very beginning is, if you don't know what you don't know, you don't know. The FC 2571, which is the core, I'm going to use the word policing policies for what Chris was and others have talked about as policing, police on campus, policing policies. And the FC 2571 is probably the most intense weaponized piece of that legislation. And the faculty code, it is the only piece of the code where you can lose tenure, where you can be docked of your pay, and when you could be suspended from your work. And if that has not necessarily affected you, that's because, as these speakers have pointed out, it often recreates the exact same hierarchies that we're dealing with in every other aspect of our life, affecting people of color, women, trans people, and anyone else who's stigmatized on the campus. So I wanted to bring 4 points that stuck out with me before I open it up for questions. And one is just the quote, quoting Jake, investigations burn the house down. Right now, it's very important for us to think about the fact that faculty only have as an option, if they're not happy with the way in which some kind of process has gone, it can be taken to a USIRO investigation. And I think it's really important to know that those investigations themselves can in turn be used again against the faculty who may have needed another form. It's sort of a rubber stamping within the university. The second thing is it possible that we're bringing the wrong tool to the task? Is it possible all conflicts are not nails, so all strategies for resolution shouldn't be hammers? And we're really thinking about what are transformative options. I want to go back to the case study that Eva said at the beginning, and go back to what Desiree said about how do we bring people to think about what happened and have that conversation before punishment, before we decide how is this policy going to unfold, to even decide what harm happened to whom. That's critical. I think it's really important in the first case that Eva talked about, in which there was a claim of violence around advocacy for Black Lives Matter resolution. What happened did not allow for the consideration that there might have been administrative harm, and at the core, anti-Black targeting of a racial justice scholar and activist. So how do we create the spaces for what happened through a lens of social and racial justice? This is what we don't have. And I guess last but not least, a point that was brought up is that without addressing root causes, what we know from restorative justice practitioners around the world is that cycles of conflict are likely to continue. There's no end to them. They repeat, and what they do is destroy affinity and begin to undermine the foundations of a community. You can't build community on top of that kind of endless conflict. So with those 4 points that have come from each of the contributions, I'd like to open it for questions. And we have people in this room and we have people on Zoom. Hallie has a microphone for those of you who'd like to ask questions in this room. Please just raise your hand or come on up here to the podium where you can be heard and seen actually on our Zoom call. And if you are in the chat, please drop questions for me or come off mute. Hallie, do we want to open this? Or I guess we'll keep the panel here.
We can open it up or panel either way, and we do have 3 questions.
All right, so let's look at the Q&A. Does anyone here have a question? Would like to come up and ask your question? Not yet. So hopefully you're writing them. And we will go to Q&A. I don't know if the panel can see these, but I think we should start. Carrie, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Sure. Let me bring them back up. I have several. Having to hold them to the end is very difficult because there are so many that bubble to the surface during every one of these talks. For Desiree, during your last image that you showed, the graph and the circles, I was curious why there were 5 volunteers to 1 core volunteer and what that means.
Yeah. So in a circle of support, what you're looking at is you're supporting the one individual. And so the volunteers are kind of, we use that term loosely, but it really is support people. It might be resources, like people who are serving as a resource, but they're all kind of coming together to figure out different kind of solutions and welcoming that person back into a space. So for example, we might use a reentry process in our institutions when a student has been suspended from the institution and has to return. In a lot of ways, they might have to go see X office, this office, this office, this office as a part of their return. But rather than them having to go to all of those individual offices, we will bring all of those offices to this one student. And in that process, we'll be able to engage in conversation around, what are the things that you did while you were gone that you were supposed, if you had, some requirements, did you meet those requirements? As you're returning back into the fold, what support services do you need that we can offer you as an institution? And so all of those people sort of represent those resources or those support services and are part then in holding each other accountable for making sure that we're supporting that person in their return. So we're kind of maintaining that obligation that we have and being the support. It could be the same thing with like someone who's out for FMLA, they return, it might be their staff members, it might be their supervisor. And so part of it is, what support services do you need from these people? What do you need to, who can you lean on in terms of understanding what has happened since you have left, developing you back into this cohort of people that maybe someone else has transitioned out since you were gone and now you're coming back and you're like, who was this new staff person? I don't know who this is, right? And so being able to do that. So those people all represent kind of being the support person for that one core individual. Hopefully that helps.
Yes, thank you. I have 2 other questions, but I don't want to take up all the space. So Rachel, go ahead and facilitate.
Thank you. We'll come back to you if we have more time. Let's ask the second question in the Q&A is from, they're all from Carrie. Well, I see so many amazing thinkers, activists, educators in this room. Is it possible that any of you have questions that you'd like to ask? Please feel free to just come off mute and you'll pop up to the toolbar at the top. Come on up. Sure.
This is a little door though, can I?
And also the panel, you may have some questions for each other. And if we don't have lots of questions, we might kind of open it up for you to talk to each other. But here's a question from the audience.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for all of this information. I have been watching the University of Washington attempt to revise our grievance and discipline rules for a long time now, and I find the whole thing overwhelming. It seems like amazing if we could get to the point where it sounds like a lot of you are at, but it also just seems like, wow, that's far from where we are now. Are there places to start that you would steer an overwhelmed faculty member like myself towards? Thank you.
I think that's open for all of you. Or maybe you'd each like to give your idea. Melissa.
I don't know. I'll just start and then maybe somebody will pick it up and tie it all together with a bow. I think for me, when I'm thinking about structural pieces, policy pieces, as you're building codes or response frameworks, I think it's really important to understand what you're doing together. And so, you know, typically our administrative kind of code processes are built around, as Jennifer kind of laid it out, those adversarial models of justice system. They try to replicate a criminal justice system that is oppressive and structurally harmful. And so if you have the opportunity to reset the intention around what you're trying to do, to say, as an educational institution, these are the things we believe in. We believe that people should learn that they are not disposable, that they are of value and worth. And we believe that we should try at all costs to understand what's happening here, to reflect on our collective accountability and responsibility for that as well, and to figure out a path forward. That's a very different starting place than we need to figure out which individual is to blame and then separate and punish them. So if you can reset the starting place, I think then you will write better policy moving forward.
I just want to jump in real quick and re-emphasize that piece. And so I actually don't remember if it's in my book chapter or not, but at some point, one of the things I talk about, and I kind of create this model for implementing restorative justice. And one of the very first steps, actually the very first step, is this idea of realigning our ideas of what justice is. So I just wanted to emphasize exactly what Melissa just said, and that part of the work is kind of going on a tour, if you will, to people who have influence and power, people who can sell the story of restorative justice, if you will, right? The people who are good at communicating that, and having them be your mouthpiece to have conversations with people about what justice really is and what it isn't, and helping people to rethink what justice could look like in our spaces and communities. And for me, that's one of the best places to start, because if you can have that conversation and you get people on board, then everything else that we say that right now sounds a little like, I don't know about that, it seems a little questionable, right, becomes a lot more, again, it's the 4 equals, right? We start having a completely different conversation if we're having the 4 equals as opposed to the 2 + 2 equals, right? So that for me is to Melissa's point, is the first place, is how do we realign people's ideas of what justice looks like, what accountability looks like, and who's responsible for that accountability.
Thank you.
Can I
Chris.
just want to pull one thread. If I could just pull one thread on that, we could
Please.
probably go on forever. So I agree. I think the other piece is to lean into what we do best as an educational institutions, so we don't have to replicate systems that we're not. We end up doing those badly anyway. So we should just lean into the power of who are we? What do we try to do every day? Where are the spaces that we really occupy this learning mandate, right? As a community, not just as, and so if you think about a theory of transformative learning, every opportunity comes up to be this disorienting dilemma where the expectation does not match the experience. And so a person who comes into these processes could expect it to look like a highly punitive adversarial process. And so we come with those, we come ready for that fight, and we come ready to have those conversations. And actually we can be helpfully disorienting if people don't end up there. If you show up and you say, oh, this isn't a fight, this is actually about building understanding instead of teaching someone a lesson, then we don't need to rely on punitive outcomes to get to what was just said. what are we trying to do here together? What's the end state that we hope to accomplish? Is better relationships, more just relationships, better connections, more equitable community. And so I would agree, but I think we really have to pay attention to just being brave enough to not replicate systems that we know are harmful and find the other pathways. I know there's other questions. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I'm thinking about just putting those three comments together as a beginning place before any process that we have. It, in my mind, transformed everything. If what we start with, this is about to be a fight, to we're going to establish value of everybody in this conversation and hear what happened. That's game changing. Kia Johnny, come off mute, come on camera if you can. Welcome from Montana. Go ahead and ask your question. Hi.
Yes, hi. I'm Kia Johnny. I'm a student and employee at the University of Washington. And thank you all for this amazing talk. I've been in and out of clinic during this time, so that's why I was off camera for a bit. But I'm curious to hear a little bit more about this cultural taxation piece that you brought up, Chris Cauce, and how y'all incorporated that into your contract. What did that actually look like? What did the conversation around that look like? And who were the players, I guess, developing this? It seemed like you had mostly faculty in your conversation, but just wanted to learn a little bit more about that, because we were just talking about not reinventing the wheel, but how did that turn out for y'all is my question.
Yeah, great. Thank you for the question. I think, the reality is that it was a process, right? And so part of the process is this, and this is just how it works in our system. There are times where you are able on one campus to get one campus senate to agree to expend resources for a particular thing. So we had a couple of campuses a little bit more piecemeal in the beginning that agreed to this idea, this notion through their senates, to say we're going to set aside a couple of course releases so that faculty who are doing kind of things above and beyond the ordinary with students can apply for this, can get some release time or sign time so that they can work on whatever it is, a mentoring project, a research activity with students of color, et cetera, et cetera. For us in our system, when we're able to do that on one campus, we're able to then turn around and say to another campus, see, they did it, why can't you? See, they did it, why can't you? And so we have been playing that game for a few years. And in this last contract, this is one of the things that we decided we wanted to push for. Okay, so in our contract, we have different articles. And so I forget the number of this particular article, but it's an article, related to our workload. And so we were able to negotiate to get this put in the contract and to get a certain amount of resource. There is a certain amount of resource that is designated in the contract. And what happens is that because our campuses are all very different, my campus, we usually hover around 34 to 35,000 students a year. We're the fifth largest by student population in the CSU. But we have some campuses like Cal State Maritime Academy, which is up the road here. It's only got a little less than 1,000 students. And mostly it's because they're training merchant marine. So they spend half the year on big ships, floating around the ocean, right? The proportion was something that was negotiated to see if there is X amount of allotment for the CSU to have funds available for cultural taxation relief, then there is a formula by which each campus is allotted a particular designation. And so that was a thing that was done through the process of negotiation, right? So our bargaining team actually had to kind of fight. And it's just like anything else. If you want $1 million, you got to ask for 4 million so that you get a little bit, right? And so there was definitely a lot of back and forth, but we had to also, and I think somebody mentioned earlier, the power of personal story and personal narrative. And so a lot of our campaign was using personal narrative and personal story to let our employer know exactly what we go through on the ground in terms of how we deal with this problem of cultural taxation and what it means for many of us, right? And we have plenty of stories of people who are amazing faculty members, but they wind up doing a massive amount of service because they're called upon to do service. And then when it's time for them to go up for tenure, or when they're going through any sort of retention, tenure, promotion process, then they turn around and say, well, that's not really the kind of service that we like, or that's not the service that's important. And oftentimes it is the exact same individual begging you to do that service. And then they turn around a year later and tell you it doesn't count for crap. right? Literally, sometimes it's the very same provost that will do that to you. And so we found this as a way to say, look, this has been going on for a really long time. We have a lot of documentation of this as people's experience, and so we need some relief. And so we were fortunate that we were able to do that, but that's the result of a fight, right? That was not a, let's make a statement and then all of a sudden our employer realizes that we're correct and it's a great idea, right? They know we suffer, they don't really care until we make them care. And so that's a piece of that. And I just, last little thing, that the previous question asked a little bit about the process of burnout. And I think this answer, you know, in terms of how we got cultural taxation recognized, is the same thing. You cannot do this work alone. You've got to work in concert with other people. Otherwise, it will burn you straight to death. And every university has problems that are greater than what any one individual can fix. And so if you're finding yourself getting burned out, that is a surefire sign that you need to reach out to your colleagues. You need to reach out to other people, because you need a team of folks to work on this, and not just an individual who carries it for everybody else.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Kia.
you.
Thank you, Chris. There was a question from the audience, and then we'll come back to you, Carrie. And there are some people who have worked so hard and who know faculty code backwards and forwards who are in this audience. And please ask questions, because I think we're all really interested in the practical implications of all the information that we're swimming in.
Yeah, should I come over here? Okay, so mine is just, it's really kind of a follow-up to AB's and thinking about what you were just talking about, Chris, too. It's sort of a question about infrastructure, right? Hearing from you is really exciting. I think all of us are thinking about all the possibilities that open. And it's collaborative work you're describing. So it's sort of replicative, right? You do it and then you bring other people into doing it, but it's also work, right? It's a lot of work. So when you're just talking about burnout now, Chris, that really resonated with me. So our institution has 7,300 faculty across the ranks. So we're a big institution. And when you were talking, Jake and Melissa, about, you know, you started talking about how it's a team of 3 of you, right? It started out as a team of 3 of you, and people knew you were there and they were calling you in. But of course, you need an infrastructure, right? So I'm assuming it's not just I hope it's not just a team of 3 of you now. So clearly, you know, I guess my question is sort of one about infrastructure and scale. Like, unionization gives you a way to bargain for resources to really implement this kind of a structure of restorative justice at scale. But how do you, like, I just would be curious to hear, like, at your institution at Dalhousie, like what do you have, right, in place to how many, you know, in terms of facilitators, in terms of, I was also thinking about Desiree's diagram and the circle, right, that you need trained facilitators, you need volunteers, like what, yeah, if you can give us a sense of what the infrastructure looks like, that'd be amazing.
Maybe I'll start, Melissa, and then you jump. Yeah. Just in terms of, so yes, that's right. So at Dalhousie, because we were starting from the fire, starting informally and then catching up, we're doing it backwards, admittedly. So we've been able to get processes aligned. And what has been helpful, actually, is that because we were doing it in this patchwork way, mostly focused on student behavior, or the thing that was in, to Chris's point, when it hits the media, what a great motivator to get the institution's attention. So they throw lots of resources at it. They clear our schedules. They make us available, but it's not sustainable, to your point. It's just responding to the crisis. So what we've come to do is start to build it into our processes. And that happened when other groups, faculty groups, and student and staff groups started to want what students were getting. If it's good for students, if it's what you're saying and what we're saying as an institution, this is how we respond. How come it's not consistent? It lacks continuity of principle, because you can't be really, really restorative in one segment of our community and then adversarial and punitive in another. So in order to do that, we had to start doing this. We are lucky to have the restorative lab at Dalhousie. So we do have resources in terms of the lab that isn't just about sort of a training center to get more facilitators. There are groups like that. International Institute of Restorative Practices can do that and give you a tool set or practice guides to do that. What we've tried to do is teach folks the principles. So we go with a way of thinking first, theory of change, and then to practice. That has been very important for us because usually the training model is teach us how to do practice, teach us how to do circles, teach us what the questions are, and we'll catch up on the other pieces. Well, people behaving badly, whether the chairs are in a circle or not, they're still behaving badly if you don't actually figure out what are we trying to do together. And so we embedded it in our policies. We started to think about how do we, so in your campus security, instead of saying, let's train all of our campus security to do restorative when the thing goes bad, how are you going to do it on the day-to-day? So you have to figure that out, not just in what do you do to divert something away from a harmful system, but actually in how you orient your work day to day. So we started asking code administrators to do that. We started asking residence dons to do that, and residence assistants, and where people, ombuds offices. So everywhere that people had a conduct or where you would come in to do reporting, we started to shift those angles first. Then we went to legal services and we started to say, when people get in trouble, who's the next person they ask for advice? So we better have those folks bought in to this so that the advice given out, even if they don't find us, they will find legal services, they're going to get there. Then we started going to HR. So HR, in your ways of dealing with the unions, in your ways of dealing with faculty groups, in your ways of dealing with each other, in terms of not just bargaining, so being respectful, interest-based, and constantly figuring out who do you want to be trying to be together, but how are you going to do this work? So we actually just started to seed it in a whole bunch of different places until those connections started to come, and organically we started to build capacity. It wasn't a training program and how do we scale up? We started to find each other, and then we bring people into processes with us. So I might take someone different next time I do something, and we're slowly building our cadre. Melissa, did I miss anything?
No, but I would say too that I think you can start to spend your time differently. So a lot of time, actually, a ton of time is spent on chasing complaints, investigating those complaints, punishing people and dealing with the fallout. As you know, to Jake's point, when the house is burned down, somebody's got to come clean that up, or you're just spending a lot of emotional energy living in the burnt house. And so there is a ton of time and energy spent in that regard. And you know, as Jake said, those kind of colleagues and places and spaces that we kind of start with often are the people who are charged to respond when things go wrong. And honestly, they get it. They get that this job sucks, that it is no fun to come to work and deal with this kind of thing and feel like you are causing harm in doing your job. I've done that job. It's not fun. It is the way that you will get burnt out. And this gives people a possible pathway that looks different. And so you actually create a lot of capacity for people to get energy back by orienting your thinking differently. And that's hard to kind of put down on paper when you're thinking about how you resource this. It's an intangible kind of asset that you're gaining, but it is monumentally different in terms of how people spend their time when they're taking a restorative approach on the everyday. So I would just kind of leave that nugget there too. And I know that sounds like a non-answer, but it has kind of rung true in our experience.
Very, very powerful. Thank you so much. All of you have built what I'm trying to collect here as a multi-level scaffolding for the beginning of transformative change. and it sounds like emergent strategy, and it sounds like viral justice. I think we have time for just the last one of your questions, Carrie, or if you can, and it's going to be a short answer so I can make sure these folks get to bed in Canada and our neighbors to the south. Would you like to read your own question, whichever one you choose?
Sure, I'm actually going to kind of switch it up just based on the conversation that happened. And Melissa, I really appreciate the whole chasing complaints. I'm a healthcare person. I'm a healthcare professional first and academic second. That's how I identify. And that is like our lives, just trying to chase complaints. And it's really hard to get in front of all of that. I think the same thing goes for our academics and pedagogy and what we're trying to do to try to push education further in a healthy and safe environment. I had a question for all of you originally about just how you approach like the open campus. You have outside influences, right? So if you're thinking about things as far as like circle of control, circle of influence, what you can actually control. We have our campus, we have our student body, we have our faculty, staff, all those folks, but then we have our community members and those who don't necessarily contribute to the community in a healthy way and threaten our campus safety. So how do you approach those kinds of situations? I'll leave it open to anybody.
I can jump in on that one if you don't mind. So you can see that picture right behind me. That is right in the middle of downtown. There are actually 2 streets in our campus, it's no longer open to cars and traffic. About 25 years ago, they blocked it off, but basically 7th Street runs through the middle of our campus and San Carlos Street, which are both major avenues in downtown, run through the middle of our campus. We have people who are not connected to our campus directly on campus all the time, like constantly. Right now this is Girl Scout cookie season. So every Girl Scout in San Jose sets up a table on campus because that's where you make money.
Sounds dangerous.
And that being said, it does create some very specific challenges with regard to safety and policing, right? Because our campus police are actually state police. And so they have a jurisdiction because all the CSU police have agreements with local law enforcement about where they patrol. So if you get pulled over anywhere within 1.5 miles of our campus, you may actually get pulled over by UPD, University Police Department. Part of our safety concern, though, has to do with, to what extent do we really want campus police doing things versus, say, city or county law enforcement, and where those lines end and begin is a lot more, it's a different challenge for us than it is. For example, we have other campuses that are in such rural areas, like nobody's there at all other than people who are on campus. I think it creates a challenge. So we have within our city also organizations that are working to create alternatives strictly to armed uniformed police officers. So those efforts have to be done in tandem. And to the other point that you made in there, though, I did want to address really quickly. And I think that my knowledge of restorative justice practice is that there have to be particular conditions in place for certain kinds of restorative techniques to be effective. And so I think at the end of the day, yes, there are some things that break down to the point where you might not have an alternative that you can use. You have to kind of go with something that's a little bit more traditional. But I think the way that you put it was as a last resort or after trying other things, I think is really where the key is. Same with the patrol from the campus to the city, right? That there are several things that have to be done in order to really create a safe community dynamic. And I don't think that it's a one size fits all thing, which is why we can't just always follow a path that was, laid out by somebody else. We have to also be very creative in our own context and do what's needed at a local level for local problem solving.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. And unless I'm going to open it in case there's a burning word with any of you four, because it's such an honor to have you. It's right our time to stop. So more than anything, I want to thank all of the panelists. I want to give back what I heard you leave us with in relationship to AB's question about where next, what's the very next step? And I heard that the first thing is seeding change, not at a training or practice level, but as a kind of a conceptual response to conflict and to generating affinity and building and repair. That's first. Two is changing energy and the seeding that change at all the points of response to conflict. So there's a pretty new audience comes maybe into perspective. The second was changing the way you use time and energy so you're not chasing after something, but calling together groups that can talk about this. Three, establishing new pathways to responses to conflict. And last, in turn, hopefully in the best of all world, that opens new energy for the kinds of creative alternatives that we might be seeking. Does that sound like I'm listening to you? And it might sound like pie in the sky, but it actually seems like it has some very real places for us to start. Good. I want to thank the audience that is here. We decided to be in person. And I want to thank you all again. Thank you for everyone that is on Zoom. Please, in the traditions of other parts of the world, come off Zoom, make some noise, come off mute, make some noise, and thank the people who brought their energy and give some of that energy back. So I invite you to all come off Zoom. Hallie, if you can put us all on.
Thank you.
Put the whole community
Appreciate you
on.
all.
Yes. Woo, woo. Make some noise, make some noise, make some noise, make some noise, make some noise.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank you,
all.
everybody.
I'm going to put a link in for some of our CFA resources in the event it's useful for anybody. A couple of things on our cultural taxation that are in there for you all.
Thank you so much. Good to see you, Mike, Dwayne, Kalfani. Thank you, Canadians. We'll see you at the next work. And wish us luck. We'll be in touch to see how your journeys are going and how our journey is going. Thank you, Desiree, Melissa, Jake, Chris. Wonderful.
Have a good evening,
wonderful.
everyone.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you, Hallie, for all of your work. Thank you, host Eva and Amy, and thank you, AAUP Executive Committee, for bringing us all together. And thank you, Diane and Avi. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm down from Western.
Right on. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you for making us a region. Good night, everybody. We'll be in touch. And thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Radical work. Beautiful work. Thank you.
Bye-bye.